How is it that even before the Second World War, Japan became the main aggressor in Asia? Militarism and a chauvinistic worldview pushed Japan to conquer China, and eventually almost all of Southeast Asia. The brutal crimes of Japanese soldiers resulted in the deaths of millions of innocent people, and over time became the basis for a deadly nuclear bombing by the US in response. This action ended the Second World War. Thanks to the modernization of the Meiji era, the Japanese economy and army have become the most advanced among Asian countries. Military successes in wars with China and Russia allowed Japan to capture Taiwan, Korea, the Liaodong Peninsula, the south of the Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands, and gain preferential terms for doing business in Manchuria. These successes, as well as the accompanying military propaganda in the newspapers, contributed to a rise of Japanese militarism and xenophobia towards its neighbors. An additional factor that stimulated Japanese aggressiveness was the inheritance of samurai ethics. It assumed that military service was the ultimate good, and that the weak and unarmed commoners deserved only cynical contempt. After World War I, Japan remained dissatisfied with its territorial acquisitions, as well as with the Washington Naval Treaty. According to it, the Japanese Navy would be 1.7 times smaller than the British and American Navy. Industrialized Japan had a small number of minerals, and so sought to establish itself in China and turn it into its resource colony. This, of course, was opposed by China itself, as well as the US, Britain, France, Italy, and Portugal, which were interested in maintaining the existing free trade regime with privileges for their businesses. At the time in Japan, the army played a very important role. Under the Constitution, the army had the power to veto parliamentary laws or government directives it did not like. Consequently, the role of the army in the state has increased, and the militarization of the economy was significantly augmented. The Japanese army grew from 188,000 in 1925 to 360,000 in 1933. Subsequently, the number of troops and military equipment in Japan only increased, indicating the presence of the Japanese command's aggressive intentions. The first casualty of the Japanese army was Chinese Manchuria, which had preferential conditions for Japanese business. The desire for a monopoly on the resources of the province led to the invasion of the Japanese army of 100,000 soldiers that happened in 1931, and the further defeat of the detached Chinese troops by Japanese forces during the following year. Taking advantage of China's civil war and the complete disorganization of Chinese forces, Japan defeated the Chinese near Shanghai at the same time. The results of this confrontation for China turned out to be disappointing. The Japanese Empire created in Manchuria a puppet state of Manchu Kuo, led by the last Chinese emperor Puyi. In Shanghai and its outskirts, Chinese defensive lines were eliminated. There were made the elimination of the Chinese army, and also additional privileges were granted to Japanese traders. The easy conquest of Manchuria prompted Japan to launch a full-scale invasion to conquer the whole of China in 1937. At first, the Japanese attacked and captured the north of China, crossed the Huanghe River, and captured Beijing. They were faced by 1.8 million Chinese soldiers. Unfortunately, they were poorly trained and demoralized, and suffered from a lack of weapons and food. Japanese aircraft outnumbered the enemy by more than 2 times, 700 combat aircraft versus 300, and also it had 8-fold tank superiority. Therefore, despite their numerical superiority, the Chinese armies suffered one defeat after another. From August to November, the Japanese army defeated the 700,000-strong Chinese force in the Battle of Shanghai during a successful landing operation involving the air and navy. After this, the Japanese army continued its offensive and captured the Chinese capital of that time, Nanjing, where it massively abused the locals and brutally killed them. Until 1939, the Japanese occupied Fuzhou. Guangzhou, and a number of other important ports in southern China, as well as most of eastern China. Progress into the central and southern lands was hampered by desperate opposition of the Chinese armies, resistance from the local population, and the lack of sufficient railways, roads, and airfields to facilitate further offensives. An ideological and strategic conflict with the Soviet Union, which supported China, and a desire to capture the Far East and southern Siberia, prompted the Japanese leadership to draw closer to Nazi Germany and conclude the Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936. Rapid Japanese expansion in Manchuria and easy wins over Chinese units made the Japanese army too self-confident. In a wave of success, Japanese forces attacked the border territory of the USSR at Lake Khasan, July to August 1938, where they were forced to retreat. For the second time, the Japanese army attempted to compete with the Soviet army in Mongolia during the battles of Halkhin Gol, May to September 1939, where it suffered a crushing defeat during an attempt to assault the fortified positions, and lost almost half of its 60,000 men killed and prisoners. Later, after the German invasion of the USSR in 1941, the Japanese command developed a plan of invasion of the Soviet Union called Kanto Kuen. According to it, Japan could have launched an invasion as far south as central Siberia if the potential enemy was completely exhausted by the war with Germany. After the United States, the Netherlands, and Britain banned oil supplies to Japan, the Japanese leadership, under pressure from the Japanese Navy, decided to prioritize the capture of territories in Southeast Asia. The region was heavily oiled and had major centers for rubber, tea, rice, cocoa, and other crops. Initially, the Japanese Expeditionary Force of 60,000 soldiers quickly de facto occupied French Indochina in September 1940, taking advantage of the defeat of France and its surrender to Germany. The territory retained a former French colonial administration and an army subordinate to the Japanese. Japanese military bases and airfields were established. In 1941, the Japanese leadership made a final plan to deploy a simultaneous war with the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. On 7 December, Japanese forces of 414 combat aircraft, 38 ships, and several dozen submarines attacked the United States' largest base in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor. As a result of this completely unexpected strike without a declaration of war, the Japanese destroyed 8 battleships, as well as 188 American aircraft, with Japan losing 29 fighters. This triumph allowed Japan to temporarily weaken its strongest adversary and led to domination by sea and air in the Asian Pacific. The next day, the 110,000-strong force of the country of the rising sun, under the cover of numerically superior aircraft, began to capture British Malaysia and the Netherlands East Indies. At the same time, another 130,000-strong Japanese group launched an operation to capture the Philippines, where it faced up to 150,000 combined U.S.-Philippine forces. Thanks to their dominance in the air and ocean, superior technology, and captured strategic initiative, Japanese forces quickly routed Allied forces in the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The Japanese captured up to 80,000 British, Australian, and New Zealanders, and about 18,000 Americans. Japan has ruthlessly exploited human and material resources in the occupied territories, brutally suppressing any hint of defiance. The local population was segregated. Some, such as the Burmese and the Indonesian, were flirted with by the Japanese leadership to enlist them in their army. Instead, Chinese, Europeans, and Americans were persecuted, arrested in concentration camps, and executed en masse after the battles, and in relatively peaceful times to intimidate the population. The cumulative death toll from Japanese terror and war crimes is up to 10 million. One of the first acts of mass terror was the Nanjing Massacre, 1937. During which Japanese troops killed up to 250,000 civilians and Chinese prisoners of war. The position of the war prisoners was more than deplorable. They often became victims of wild amusements, such as beheading competitions, and were massively killed in contravention of international humanitarian law. They were also used as slave laborers without adequate food or medical care, and in the event of strength loss, such war prisoners were usually executed. For example, during the Bataan Death March, more than 18,000 Filipino and American prisoners were killed by bullets, swords, disease, and dehydration. Japanese soldiers resorted to the mass rape of women in the occupied territories. Also, the Japanese Empire organized a huge network of sexual slavery at the so-called comfort stations. The victims of this crime were up to 300,000 women from the occupied territories. The cynicism and sadistic superiority of the Japanese command led to the formation of Unit 731, which conducted a variety of horrific experiments on living people from the occupied territories. For example, without anesthesia, cutting out various organs and watching how long a person can live without them. The unit also developed and tested bacteriological weapons, with prisoners as subjects. Once entrenched in the occupied territories, the Japanese army began advancing toward British India and Australia. Japan succeeded in capturing Burma, where a puppet state was subsequently formed, as well as northern New Guinea and a number of islands to the north. However, at this point, the victorious advance of the Japanese army collapsed. The Allies had much more powerful economies and a larger population, with which they rebuilt their forces. In addition, the new American fighters and bombers were significantly ahead of the Japanese, which, combined with their increased production, provided the US and its allies an air advantage. The first decisive battles with the victory of anti-Japanese forces occurred in the Coral Sea and at Midway Atoll. In the last standoff, the Japanese lost 248 aircraft and 4 aircraft carriers on equal terms, demonstrating a definitive shift to American air dominance. The battle that destroyed all the plans of the Japanese Army's overland advance was the Guadalcanal Campaign, August 7, 1942 to February 9, 1943, in which Allied forces destroyed about 20,000 Japanese on this small island and shot down up to 800 enemy aircraft. After these battles, the initiative passed to the US and its allies. The Allies then proceeded to gradually push Japanese forces out of the Pacific Islands and attack the supply line and rear of Japan. The New Guinea campaign was a case in point. Japanese units were almost fully cut off from the normal supply of weapons and food since 1943, and lost more than 200,000 dead soldiers by 1945. At the same time, the US and Australian armies lost about 14,000 soldiers. The pushing of Japanese troops out of the tropical jungle was too slow due to the stubborn resistance of the Japanese and the difficult terrain. Therefore, the Allied command decided to send the main airstrike to the Philippines and the aircraft to Japan. At this time, Japanese despair sometimes took radical forms. Since October 1944, due to a shortage of bombers, some Japanese pilots have become suicide bombers to defeat enemy ships and other military targets. However, such acts of desperation did not prevent the United States and the Allies from carrying out a successful Philippines campaign, in which a 600,000-strong army defeated a 530,000-strong Japanese group that lost only 336,000 men. In December 1944, Japan, which was cut off from sea supplies of oil and other resources from Malaysia and Indonesia, moved on to the last major offensive in China. This attack led to the formation of a Japanese corridor through southern China and the construction of a railway in it, which supplied fuel to Japan via Indochina to Malaysia and Indonesia. However, the defeat of Nazi Germany by the Allies in May 1945 freed up enormous military resources that were quickly diverted to fight Japan. By July 1945, British forces had liberated Burma, and on August 8th, the Soviet Union had started the war with Japan, attacking Japanese forces in Manchuria with almost 2 million troops, which was 1.7 times the size of the Japanese Guandong Army. Soviet aviation was 8 times bigger, and Soviet tanks number was 9 times bigger than Japanese ones. The Soviet army rapidly advanced through the territory of Manchuria, inflicting painful defeats on the less numerous and exhausted Japanese army. The Japanese lost a total of 82,000 dead, but retained combat capability and an army that surrendered only after the end of the war. At the same time, the Chinese armies of Kuomintang and the Communists were able to recapture almost all of China except the central east coast. The final point in the war with Japan was set by American aircraft. Observing the fierce resistance of Japanese troops, the U.S. decided to drop nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to frighten Japan and save the lives of American soldiers. These devastating strikes killed more than 80,000 people instantly and turned the centers of these cities into nuclear conflagrations. By the end of the year, another 150,000 people, the vast majority of them civilians, had died from radiation exposure and injuries. The shock of these attacks forced the military command and Emperor Hirohito to issue a decree of unconditional surrender of Japan. However, fighting continued in Asia and the surrounding islands. The final terms of Japan's surrender were agreed upon on 2 September 1945 aboard the battleship Missouri. According to them, Japan was deprived of all occupied territories. It has lost Taiwan, Korea, Manchukuo, and islands in the Pacific Ocean. Also, it has lost the right to have an effective army. Japanese military and civilians indicted for war crimes have been tried before an international tribunal. The rise of militarism, xenophobia, and chauvinism in Japan as a result of easy victories in the early 20th century led to annexation plans against China even before World War II. The capture of northeastern China, on the one hand, fueled imperial conquests throughout Asia, and on the other, led to the deterioration of relations with the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom. This led to Japan's alliance with Nazi Germany and subsequent military aggression by Japanese forces against the United States, the colonial possessions of Britain, the Netherlands, and their allies. At first, through a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and a swiftly orchestrated push, the Japanese succeeded in capturing almost all of Indochina, present-day Malaysia, Indonesia, parts of New Guinea, and islands in the Pacific Ocean. In the conquered territories, Japanese soldiers had been particularly violent, carrying out ethnic cleansing, plundering the local population, carrying out mass executions to frighten people, and raping and taking women into sexual slavery. But the economic and technological potential of the U.S. and its allies turned out to be greater, leading to a further reversal of the war and Japan's defeat.